I have prepared only a few remarks on the economic contents of the default in the Czech Republic, partly as the result of certain empiric studies, but also my personal experience. And today I'd like to highlight the economic accents, the economic perspective of these issues, and intentionally I'd like to avoid the legal regulation of these problems. Actually, to provide you with some topics that could be good food for following discussion. In the introduction of my presentation, I'd like to use a certain anchoring of this presentation or a base, a chart that shows one important aspect, that if we analyze the economic contents of the default, it is usually not a coincidental phenomenon that would occur out of blue, but usually it is quite a long process that has its own principles, and if it is not dealt with, it leads to insolvency. And if you look at this chart, and you can see that cash flow insolvency comes in the last but one phase of the crisis, and also over-indebtedness. I'd like to focus more in this presentation is not anchored here, and this is on a purpose, because the over-indebtedness as perceived by economists is a certain condition, is a certain status that usually precedes the crisis of liquidity. We can return to this picture later on. It has been quite a tradition that during my presentations I am trying to substantiate my view with research that has been done for quite a long time at the University of Economics. And for today's presentation, I have chosen this chart, which illustrates these topics quite clearly. At the University of the Economics, under the supervision of Mr. Smrčka, the team analyzed 3,222 insolvency proceedings of corporate bankruptcies. And an interesting view of this sample is as for the number of the decisions on insolvency, and number says that almost 50% of opened insolvency proceedings did not end up with the decision on insolvency due to non-existence of assets. And if we look at the remaining 54%, in this sample, 50% ended up with no performance in favor of the registered creditors. This is quite an interesting number, but we have to look at it in more details and do not make hasty conclusions. For example, in that the company just before the opening of the insolvency proceedings just stripped their assets. If we look at that, in the majority of cases, these were the companies in terms of fixed assets or long-term assets So their value was minimum, and these were most of the time limited liability companies that were involved in business activities, and a large part of their assets were current assets. And well, we can say that maybe even after the starting of their business activity got down to the threshold of over-indebtedness because they accumulated various inventories that were not possible to be sold. And insolvency proceedings in such cases should be commenced early enough. It is important not only in maintaining sufficient assets to satisfy the creditors, but to prevent irresponsible creation of liabilities, because usually the assets base was similar and the liabilities only increase. Outstanding debts occurred in the majority of cases. The satisfaction of debts was at the level of 3 or 4%. I quite often hear inspirational remarks from the colleague Mr. Richter, and I liked his idea to look at this from a different perspective, from the perspective of large corporations who entered in bankruptcy, and to compare it with the proceeds after reorganization. And currently, with the 3 students, for 3 or 4 months, we have been going through the 20 largest insolvency proceedings in terms of turnover, who have in most cases already been completed. It means that a substantial part of the creditors' claims have been satisfied. Important in terms of monetization of the assets. The results have not been verified yet. But the initial information shows that there is quite a similar proceeds, especially in relation to secured creditors. It's like to reorganization. It means in systemic banking creditors. It is actually quite logical that the banks as systemic players in this area are constantly working on their know-how in order to reduce their credit risk, and if defaulted by the client, they want to achieve the highest possible satisfaction of their claims. So the first results are quite interesting, and I'm quite curious whether this assumption will be confirmed. And we would like to extend this set of insolvency proceedings to include 50 and not only 30. And it may turn out that the insolvency proceedings, at least a part of the companies, were maintained. So for most of the companies, this is an alternative that can be comparable with the reorganization in terms of disposition rights, for example. So this table is important for us to have a look at the obligations of the statutory bodies, that the statutory bodies should not increase the liabilities and should not increase the claims of the creditors. I'd like to repeat that at the University of the Economics, we look at the default and the rescue of companies from the economic perspective. We think that this is actually our topic, and law is a certain tool how to efficiently deal with the companies in crisis. And we should not forget about the four main factors that influence the efficiency, which is time, the expected income, or expenditures, if we speak about the rescue process, and also the risk, which increases with the duration of the process. Today, I'd like to focus on cash flow insolvency, only marginally, because this issue is discussed by professional public, because starting from the 1st of July, the liquidity and the cash flow insolvency will be assessed. So from the economic point of view, I'd like to emphasize that, again, we need to differentiate temporary cash flow insolvency that does not necessarily lead to default. There is a we should actually talk about how to cover this gap, within what time. But the problem is a systemic cash flow insolvency that leads to the default of the company. And the systemic insolvency is the result of four basic factors, and we need to bear them in mind. This is insufficient operating profitability and cash flow, insufficient margins at operating level of the company, and last but one is the mistakes during management of the working capital, and also high demands for the administration of the debt. I would like to jump over this slide and now to focus on the over-indebtedness issues, because I think this is the topic that is very often ignored. And if we look at the statistic number, the people who are interested in these topics would confirm that the cases when the default decision was issued due to over-indebtedness are not many. I myself know only about 2 cases from my experience, and this is a really very low number. The over-indebtedness is meant to be a substantial imbalance in the capital structure of the business, and it needs to be assessed when looking at the ability of the permanent existence of the undertaking. I'm not using the concept of going concern because it may be a misleading term in this context, and later on I will explain why. The assessment of the permanent existence of the business is very important. Without doing it, any other discussions over the rescue of the company, value of the company, on how to continue may be wrong. And it is necessary to bear this in mind. We have heard it several times, this term going confirm, but actually the basic criteria have not been mentioned, and I think it's very important to repeat it, because even based on my experience, I can see, or from my practice, I know about many mistakes that they do not. I know about many companies where their permanent existence have not been confirmed, and we may decide these aspects into financial and non-financial. And it is very important to take this into consideration when we're dealing with the crisis of the business. Non-financial criteria include the answer to the most important question, whether the company at a certain moment has a product at their disposal, or a product that will soon be in the market, and if yes, whether there is a market for that product. If the market does exist, and if we have the product, then the question is whether we are able whether the product is competitive, and whether the revenues related to this product are able to create value both for creditors and providers of the equity capital in the long term. It is very important to answer this question. There are many cases when we could witness attempts for the rescue of the companies. There are really numerous such cases. Recently, I could hear the presentation of Mr. Kuda about the Popron company, and we could see quite clearly how the attempts for the rescue of the company, where the main methods of sale was the catalog. So the rescue and restructuring at that time were almost in all cases a failure. The same we can say about the attempts to rescue businesses who were traditional textile companies. So in these cases, we need to answer these questions. So these were non-financial assumptions, and now financial assumptions for maintaining the permanent existence of the company. This is related to the financial stability, liquidity, efficient work, the working capital and its individual components. So financial and non-financial components of the permanent existence of the business. Then there are other criteria, especially the ability of innovation, introducing innovative products in the market, and business model, distribution model, operating relationships, their manner of organization, and so on. So if we look at the value of the business, we look at the assumptions of preconditions of the successful rescue process of the company, we should always answer the question we should answer the question about the permanent existence of the company, and I intentionally avoid the term of going concern. And now I actually ask for help to experts who are experienced in the valuation of businesses. I think it is actually a good tool how to a good tool in the whole process. And if speaking about the evaluation of the business, I will speak about it not from the point of view of statutory requirements, but it's a valuation of value that should be done on an ongoing basis and should test the various types of value, and based on that certain decisions should be made. So these are optional ways of valuation, and if I look at it from the point of view of the confirmed going concern, then there are certain situations that we need to take into account. This, yes, going concern has been confirmed. It means the permanent existence or going existence of the company. And if I make a valuation of the business and the result is negative, then at this moment I can think that the business is over-indebted. If the going concern has been confirmed, the valuation should not show a negative value. What I have in mind, or what I want to emphasize, is the so-called permanent existence of the business. It may be a situation when the company shows operating results comparable with the competitor, but for some reason they still have some liabilities from the past that can be a result of some bad investment decision, or it may be some security provided. In such a situation, the negative result may occur and may be acceptable. So then we can look at it from the liquidation value point of view, because if the liquidation value of the business is positive, it, in my opinion, does not mean that the company is over-indebted, and the activity of the business should be stopped, and the positive balance should be divided among the creditors. Both the liquidation value and the value set by the special method, if in such a situation is negative, then there is no doubt that the business is over-indebted and that it should deal with its liabilities within a formal insolvency proceedings.
But to make things even less simple, or let's go even one more step back. I'm sure my colleagues, the valuation experts from different valuation institutions who do the valuation in such proceedings, how to proceed if an expert valuation is to be prepared, or a document declaring a company is over-indebted or not, How would you approach it, which method to choose, and which category of value would you select? When analyzing different expert valuation documents with my students, we've seen that the variability of the methods used is very high. Interesting article from 2016 by Mr. Krabec and Mr. Čipera, who looked at this from the point of view of the prices achieved in the usual method versus liquidation method, and I can only agree and confirm with their conclusions. Which method to use when deciding if a company is over-indebted, and then such a document could be used for the court. In our mini-survey, the majority of the expert valuations was using the objective method, objectivized method. So in fact a certain procedure that can be verified and that is standardized. And particularly in cases where assessing revenue generation as something that will happen with a large level of transparency. So this method is based on the German system, and we must take into account one fact that can be both positive and negative. To a certain extent, this method does not and cannot use and apply subjective assumptions, expectations of the shareholders or the management, where they would say, we are ready to implement rescue measures. Once the measures are implemented, the financial stability will be restored, the market will start functioning again, the business will start functioning well again, and we will have the required level of margins, thus creating preconditions for further existence of the company and its capability to repay its obligations. The question is the rescue assumptions. I think these are the hardest. This is the hardest thing to assess, and the question is how to include them in the evaluation. At present, there is a very strong information asymmetry where the company is in an advantageous position. An expert valuator looking at an over-indebted company is expected to be very critical, and he is expected to only include those revenues, those yields that can be expected with a very high level of probability. And as for the rescue measures, only those that have already been implemented or will be implemented in the shortest possible future. And whether the proposals will be credible. 5 minutes left. One more comment related to the liquidation value, something that's used quite a lot in insolvency proceedings. If the revenue method is negative and the liquidation method is negative as well, does not necessarily lead to stop of activity, then we have to look at the revenue value brutto and the liquidation value brutto gross. If it's higher, then I think it is legitimate to stop the activities of the company and sell individual assets as part of the liquidation proceedings, either through insolvency or through another proceedings. Nevertheless, the liquidation methods also has some weak points. Usually it leaves aside the non-quantified non-material assets like know-how or the network of contacts and customers. This is often not included in the liquidation value. So if the gross liquidation value is slightly higher than using the revenue method, you have to be very prudent and take into account these additional non-tangible assets. Based on my experience, I can say that the perception of the liquidation value is very important from the point of view of structuring the assets into logical packages that will then be offered for sale during the liquidation. There are two approaches: 100% atomization, where I will be selling basically brick by brick, to a more complex approach where everything is sold through one contractual agreement. Again, this is a factor that the expert valuator, as well as the creditors and managers, must take into account, and they should come up with a suitable structuring of the liquidation proceedings.
Možná jenom na závěr, už jenom z toho, co bylo uvedeno, tak se dá říct, že zatímco platební schopnost je něco, co věřitelé zpravidla pozorují poměrně.
I would say that the incapacity to pay is something, the over-indebtedness is default that is hidden to creditors, while incapacity to pay is obvious default, we could say. So the over-indebtedness can, let's say, stay hidden from the creditors for a slightly longer period. And the question is how to proceed and how to introduce a duty for the companies to solve out and to start working on the problem early enough before it gets converted into a incapacity to pay. Thank you for your attention. During my presentation, where I was focusing on various aspects related to company rescue as well.